Hi, my name is Stuart Weems and welcome to the Investopoly podcast. My goal is to share easy to understand evidence-based holistic insights to help you master the game of building wealth. And if you enjoy these podcasts, just as I always like to remind you, please maybe share it with anyone that you think might benefit from it and or leave a rating wherever you're listening to it in terms of podcast platform. That'd help me greatly. Thanks heaps for that. Anyway, let's get into today's episode. Today's episode is really about the risks associated with one spouse making all the financial decisions. And it's really common that one spouse will naturally, have an inclination or proficiency with financial affairs. And so it's logical for them to sort of run with most of the financial decision making of the household. And perhaps maybe the other spouse might be completely disinterested in the financial decision making. And whilst this might be sort of a convenient situation, it's really critical for a lot of different reasons, which I'm going to talk about today, that both spouses at least have a basic understanding of one, where their assets and liabilities are, the broad sort of strategy, and then, who are the people that are helping with respect to that. Now, I don't want to offend anyone by making some gross generalizations, but it is a very common situation that I have witnessed where a husband and wife or two spouses will separate. One spouse has been the dominant sort of decision maker. In that separation situation, the non-dominant financial spouse then has a substantial amount of catch up to do in terms of working out, okay, what assets do we hold? What liabilities do we hold? How does it all work? Then they've got to start making some pretty substantial financial decisions for themselves, and they're not necessarily had the experience to do so. And if that spouse hasn't been active, they might end up learning about, what their just recently separated spouse has been up to during the marriage, which may or may not, really please them. And to avoid those situations happening, of course, if we're all in relationships, we all hope those relationships are going to be healthy and happy and have a lot of longevity. But in case they don't, it's just prudent, I think, to have a good overview of your own personal financial situation, even if you are relying on your spouse to, make most of the financial decisions. And I think that begins with, just the overarching idea of know what you're signing. So quite often we can ask our spouses to sign some documents or materials and so forth. It's really important that they understand what they're signing and that they feel comfortable to sort of ask that question. And you should be able to explain it in very simple terms. Now, they don't necessarily need to know the absolute minutiae and detail of it, but just generally, this is how things are structured, or these are the potential risks that could go wrong. And if your spouse is asking you to sign something and they can't really explain, what it's doing, well, then you've got to think about getting some advice from the mortgage broker or accountant or lawyer or whatever, a third party that can, again, explain it in very simple terms. Sometimes when we go off to get things signed off by lawyers, they can be problematic in terms of, the lawyer's role to cover their own risk might be to list 160 things that could go wrong, and that's their job. So sometimes that doesn't really allay concerns, it just aggravates them. Now, I'm not talking you out of that, but, having a balanced approach, I think, between just helping people understand what's going on, and there's risk to everything, but if you're really prudent about your financial decision making, it shouldn't be too much of a cause of alarm in most situations, I wouldn't have thought. The next factor to think about is, what happens if you're not around? So if you are the main decision maker for your family's finances, what happens if you're no longer around, you get hit by a bus? How is your spouse going to handle matters? Well, one answer could be, if they're more involved and they have a sort of broad understanding, they might not necessarily need to do it all themselves. They might need to get some advice, but at least they'll feel a little bit more confident to make those decisions, or to make those decisions with some consultation of advice, and they'll have a bit more experience, kind of leading into that sort of situation. And of course, it's a very stressful time, so you really do want to make it as stressless as possible, or at least not contribute further to the stress. And one way you can do that is just making sure that they know where to find everything. So having a summary of your assets and liabilities is an excellent start, and you might make that as detailed as possible, including sort of ownership structures and account details, numbers, and so forth. Using a password manager is also something that's going to make it really easy, so that all passwords are in one place, and they can log into the super or share portfolio or internet banking, those sorts of things. And making sure that your spouse has met all the relevant advisors as well. So you might work with an accountant, financial advisor, lawyer, etc., and your instructions to your spouse might be, look, if I'm not around, go and speak to these people. You don't necessarily leave it until that time for them to make that introduction. If they're able to sort of build a little bit of a relationship with those trusted individuals whilst you're around, that'll go a long way to making it a little bit more comfortable for them. Because if there's that level of trust, then obviously those advisors can help the surviving spouse, through quite what is a very difficult time. Now, as the saying goes, plan for the worst, hope for the best. And I don't want to be a negative Nelly here, but the statistics are that 40% of marriages end in divorce or separation. So I think, we've got to play the statistics here in terms of risk management. And, there's things that you can do whilst, you want to make sure that your relationship is going to be, going to thrive and be very successful. Of course, there's things that you can do to, make sure that you'll be able to look after your finances if that wasn't the case. And in my experience with relationship breakdowns, a lot sort of start amicably, and they both partners agree, look, let's just be really logical about this and we don't want to end up paying a lot of money to lawyers, etc. And some are successful in doing that, but I would say the vast majority, 80% or plus, unfortunately turn acrimonious. They don't end as the two parties intend at the beginning. And so you need to appreciate that as well and make sure that you take the actions, assuming that if you do separate, it's not necessarily going to be on friendly terms. And so I think there's two really key things that you can do here. The first one is ensure you've got a comprehensive knowledge of your financial situation, including all assets, debts, income, expenses. Without that sort of starting knowledge, if the worst was to happen in terms of a relationship breakdown, if you don't have that knowledge to discover that information, can be really difficult and very stressful. But if you have a good idea of, what are your assets and liabilities, that's a really good starting point. Another key learning that I've just experienced recently is just make sure that you can become financially independent. So, even just things like using internet banking and knowing how that works. Do you have a credit card in your own name? If you need to become financially independent and you're using one spouse's credit cards and you don't have an income, for example, it might be hard to, set yourself up in that way. So thinking those sorts of sort of practical things to be able to sort of protect your own share of equity in the marital asset pool, I think is prudent. And so what do you do if your spouse is kind of disengaged in this whole thing? You sort of encourage them to get more engaged. What do you do? Well, I would start by sort of just having a regular meeting about your financial situation and the financial decisions and investment performance and those sorts of things. Now, I'm a financial planner, so that's that's pretty natural for me to do, and it's something my wife and I do regularly in terms of just making sure she understands what's going on and what assets we have and how it's all moving, hopefully in the right direction. And thankfully it is, as you should expect it to be. And that means, explaining things. You might need to explain things a few different times until it starts to, really become understandable for that person. But I think forcing them to come to that meeting or to spend that sort of 20 minutes, doesn't have to be huge, just overviewing something is going to really help them, I think. And it helps their understandability and, inviting them to ask questions and also inviting them to meetings that you're going to. So I really enjoy it when my client that I might have been dealing with primarily invites their spouse along. One, it gives me an opportunity. In fact, I often insist on at least meeting them every so often, but it gives me an opportunity to meet them, but also and make sure they understand what's going on, but also build a relationship with me as well. And finally, the last thing to think about is, what are your instructions to your spouse should you not be around anymore? Firstly, I think drafting a letter of wishes is a good idea because in a very stressful situation, they might not recall the conversation. And so a letter of wishes is really just a letter to your spouse to say, look, go to this person for this advice, do this to these assets, hold on to these assets, etc., etc. Just sort of guiding them through the decision making about, and you don't have to be too codified with it, but it could be just as simple as say, go to this accountant for this particular advice or this lawyer for this particular advice. And if you don't have a financial advisor, but you think your spouse might need one, identifying, who you might entrust with that decision can be really helpful as well. So, you might be happy to manage your own finances at this stage, but you might realize, look, my spouse might not have the inclination to do that, then that's fine. in the letter of wishes, you might say, look, go and speak to XYZ in order to get that advice. Anyway, it's a bit of a shorter topic today, but I thought it was a really important one that, and I think if you're listening to this podcast, chances are you're probably the person in your family unit that is making the financial decisions and have an interest in finance. So hopefully if your spouse is less interested in it and you really are interested in getting them interested, that's a lot of words. Hopefully this podcast gives you some tips for doing that, and hopefully maybe you can even get them to listen to this episode. And if they do, my advice for them is to really protect yourself and make sure you understand what's going on with your money, and it's really important for you to do that. Okay, until next week, bye for now.